At 62, I walked out of the last boardroom I would ever sit in, drove straight to a lumber yard I had never once set foot in before, bought $400 of white oak I did not know how to use, and built a table in my garage that nobody had asked me to build. And it took me almost 3 years to understand that it was the most successful thing I had ever made in my entire life. I'm telling this now because my granddaughter asked me last week over that very table why I keep it the way I do, scratched and a little uneven in one corner, when I could easily afford a nicer one, and I gave her a short answer at the time because the real one takes longer than dinner allows. So here it is, the long answer for her and for anyone else standing where I was standing 3 years ago. My name is Patricia. I'm 65 now. I spent 31 years climbing inside a manufacturing company called Colson Industries, starting as a junior analyst and finishing as vice president of operations. And for almost all of those 31 years, if you had asked me what success looked like, I would have described it to you in the exact language the company used in its own performance reviews, without ever noticing that I had let someone else write the definition I was living inside of. I want to be honest about what that climb actually cost, because I spent a long time only telling the version where it was worth it. I have 2 children, Kevin and Laura, both grown now with families of their own, and I missed a genuinely embarrassing number of the things parents are supposed to be present for. Recitals, a broken arm, Laura's first heartbreak, because there was always a deadline that felt at the time more real than any of it. I told myself, the way I think a lot of people in my position tell themselves, that I was building something for them, a stable home, a good school district, a mother they could be proud of, and some of that was true, and some of it was simply where I felt most competent. And it is a very seductive thing to spend your best hours on the place where you feel most competent instead of the place where you're actually needed. I remember one specific incident that I've never told anyone in my family from when Kevin was maybe 10. He'd built something for a school science fair, a working model of a water filtration system entirely on his own, and he'd asked me twice that week if I'd be able to come see it presented, and I'd said yes both times, meaning it. And then a plant issue in Ohio came up that Thursday, the kind of fire that always felt in the moment like the one emergency that truly could not wait, and I flew out instead. He won second place. I found out from a photo Alan sent me. Kevin holding a small ribbon, smiling the specific smile kids give a camera when they've already decided not to make anyone feel bad about who wasn't there. My husband Alan used to say, gently, maybe twice a year, that the company would replace me within a month of my leaving and the kids never would, and I used to nod at him the way you nod at something you agree with in principle and have no intention of acting on, because agreeing with him would have meant admitting that the thing I was pouring myself into wasn't actually as irreplaceable as it needed to be for the sacrifice to make sense. The climb itself felt like success for a very long time. I want to be honest about that too, because I think people who've never felt it assume it must be hollow the whole way through, and it isn't, not at first. Each promotion genuinely did feel like proof of something. I liked the corner office. I liked being the person whose calendar other people had to work around. I liked, more than I would have admitted at the time, walking into a room and watching people sit up a little straighter, and I built a very full life out of collecting that specific feeling over and over for 3 decades. The end came the way these things often do now, not with a dramatic firing, but with a restructuring, a new CEO who wanted his own leadership team, a severance package delivered by someone in HR who was younger than my own daughter, in a tone so practiced and kind that it somehow made the whole thing worse. I was 62. I had 11 months left by my own old timeline Before, I would have retired on my own terms, with my own party, my own choice of words for the goodbye speech, and instead I got a cardboard box and a security escort to my own car in a parking garage I had parked in every weekday for over a decade. I drove home that day and did not go inside right away. I sat in the driveway for a long time, and I want to describe what I actually felt because it surprised me. It wasn't grief exactly, not yet. It was closer to a kind of vertigo, the specific dizziness of realizing that the entire structure I had used to measure my own worth for 31 years had just been dismantled by someone I had met 4 times, and that I did not, in that moment, have a second structure standing by to catch me. I want to describe one of those 2 board interviews specifically because it's the one I still think about. I sat across from a panel of 5 people, 3 of whom were younger than Kevin, and I gave what I genuinely believed was a strong account of 31 years of operational experience. And about halfway through, I watched one of them glance at his phone, not rudely, just briefly, the way you glance at a phone when a conversation has stopped holding your full attention. And I felt something in my chest that I had not felt directed at me in over 3 decades. The specific quiet sting of being the least interesting person in a room I used to run. I did not get that seat, and for the first time in my adult life, I understood exactly why, and it had nothing to do with my qualifications. The next few months were harder than I expected, and I think this is the part people don't always say out loud about a story like mine. I applied for 2 board positions and didn't get either. I consulted briefly for a competitor and hated almost every hour of it, not because the work was hard, but because I kept catching myself performing competence for an audience that had already stopped watching me the way my old audience once had. I started noticing, with a discomfort I didn't have a name for yet, how much of my own self-worth had been rented rather than owned, and how expensive the rent had actually been the whole time I wasn't looking at the bill. The turning point, if I'm honest, wasn't dramatic. It happened at Thanksgiving, the first one after I left Colson, at Laura's house, a table full of people I loved, and I remember sitting there, physically present, completely unable to follow the actual conversation happening around me, because some old reflex in me kept scanning the room for status the way I used to scan a boardroom, quietly ranking who was doing well and who wasn't, who had followed an impressive path and who hadn't. And I caught myself doing this to my own son-in-law's cousin, a genuinely kind man who teaches middle school and was telling a warm story about one of his students. And I realized mid-story that I had not actually heard a single word of it because I'd been too busy grading him. I excused myself from that table for a few minutes, stood in Laura's kitchen, and had the most honest conversation with myself I'd had in years. I asked myself what I had actually built in 31 years that I still owned free and clear, that nobody could restructure out from under me with a severance package and a security escort, and I did not have a fast answer. And the not having a fast answer frightened me more than the layoff itself had. I went home that weekend and almost on impulse drove to a lumber yard, which is not a place I had any business being. I did not know the difference between oak and pine. I did not own a single tool beyond a hammer and a box of mismatched screwdrivers. I bought the wood because our own dining table, the one Alan and I had owned for 20 years, had a wobble in one leg I'd been meaning to fix for at least 5 of them. And some part of me, standing in that lumber yard, decided I was finally going to build a new one myself instead of paying someone else to do it. Though I want to be honest that I could not have told you at the time why that specific project felt so urgent. It took me 4 months, working evenings and weekends in the garage, ruining 2 full boards through simple ignorance, watching more instructional videos than I care to admit, and I want to describe the specific feeling of sanding that first tabletop by hand, badly, unevenly, because it is the closest thing I can give you to the actual turn in this story. For 31 years, my competence had been the whole point, the thing I traded on, the thing that made me valuable in every room I walked into. Standing in that garage, genuinely terrible at something, sawdust in my hair, making a visible mess of a simple joint, I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember, which was simply present entirely inside the thing I was doing, with no one in the room to rank me against. I want to be honest about the 4 months themselves because I've made the process sound tidier than it actually was. I ruined the first full tabletop attempt in month 2, misjudging how the boards would move once I'd glued them, and I stood in that garage staring at a warped, unusable slab of white oak I'd spent 2 weekends on, and I remember laughing, actually laughing alone at how completely I had failed at something with no board watching, no quarterly review attached to it, no consequence beyond my own evening, and how strange it was that the failure felt almost weightless compared to failures I'd carried for months back at Colson. I started over the next weekend with the boards I had left. The table itself, when I finally finished it, is not especially beautiful by any professional standard. There's a slightly uneven seam on the left side where I misjudged a cut, and a burn mark near one corner from a router, mistake I made in month 3, that I never quite managed to sand all the way out. Alan offered more than once to help me fix that corner properly, and I told him, and I meant it, that I wanted to leave it exactly as it was because it was the part of the table that was actually true. I started using it differently than I'd used our old table. I began inviting people, not the people whose presence would have looked good on some invisible scorecard I no longer needed, but the actual people I had spent 3 decades too busy for. I called the son-in-law's cousin, the middle school teacher, and asked him genuinely to tell me more about his students, and I sat there at my own uneven table and listened all the way through without once ranking him against anyone. One of the earliest dinners at that table, I want to admit, went badly. I'd invited Kevin's whole family and Laura's whole family the same week, 6 months in, still half performing the old version of myself without quite noticing, wanting the table full because a full table had always read in my old language as a kind of success in itself, and I spent most of that dinner refereeing 2 kids' meltdown over a shared toy, and burnt the roast-checking email during the one window I'd meant to leave my phone in the other room, and Alan looked at me afterward, not unkindly, and asked if that dinner had actually been for them or for some idea I still hadn't let go of. I didn't have a good answer that night either. I started having Sunday dinners, small ones at first, Alan and me, and whichever of the kids could make it, and then they grew, slowly, the way real things tend to grow, rather than the way I used to force things to grow in quarterly increments. Laura brings her kids most weeks now. Kevin drives up when he can, and even when he can't, he calls during dinner just to be part of the noise of it for a few minutes. My granddaughter has her own chair now, an old mismatched one I found at an estate sale because I'd stopped caring whether the furniture around the table matched, which is its own small confession about the kind of person I used to be. I want to be honest that this was not some clean, total transformation, because I don't think those actually happen to real people, only to people in stories that are trying to sell you something. I still catch the old reflex sometimes, sizing up a room, measuring a conversation by whether it's productive, and I have to consciously set that reflex down. The way you'd set down something heavy you've simply carried so long, your arm forgot it was a choice. Some weeks the table sits empty except for Alan and me, and those weeks used to feel like failure to me, and now, mostly, they just feel like a Tuesday. About a year into building this new life, I got a call about a board seat again, a real one this time, a small manufacturing company that actually wanted my experience rather than my old title, and I took it. And I want to be clear that I am not telling you I walked away from ambition entirely, because that would be its own kind of tidy lie. I still work. I still care about doing that work well. What's different is what I hang the actual weight of my worth on now, and it is no longer the seat, it's the table, the one with the crooked seam, and whether the people I love are still choosing freely to sit down at it. Laura told me last month, almost in passing, that she used to be a little afraid of me growing up, not because I was unkind, but because she always felt like she was being quietly evaluated. And she said it gently, not as an accusation, more as an observation she'd finally found safe enough to say out loud. And I sat with that for a long time afterward, because I recognized exactly the woman she was describing, and I am still, some days, not entirely sure I've stopped being her, only that I now have a table that reminds me every week to try. My granddaughter, the one who asked me about the scratches, is 8, and she does not care in the slightest that I used to run operations for a company with 4,000 employees. What she cares about is that the corner of the table nearest her chair has a burn mark shaped, if you squint, a little like a rabbit, and that I let her keep pointing it out every single week like it's the first time either of us has noticed it. I don't have a tidy formula to hand you for what success actually is, and I've come to believe anyone who hands you one that clean is probably still selling something. What I have instead is this. I spent 31 years building a career that could be taken from me in a single afternoon by someone who barely knew my name, and I spent 4 clumsy months building a table that nobody can restructure out from under me, because nobody but me decides who gets to sit at it. And most nights now, when I look down that table and count the chairs that are full, that counting feels more honest than any performance review I was ever handed in my whole working life.